All right, this is the start of our unit on learning, a series of lectures where we're going to cover a variety of things in this area. When I say learning, you have a automatic association with what learning is like. You're engaged in learning as a human being throughout your life. You're engaged in learning as a student in this class. But there are some important psychological principles behind the very simple act of learning different associations between things, learning what actions are going to lead to what responses from your environment, and starting to understand when you should imitate other people and notice things that are happening to them. So, to go through all of those different things, we're going to talk about classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and talk just a bit about observational and social learning. And you'll see a lot of the lessons that we're going to talk about here will carry forward into some other units in class. So, learning and our next unit, memory, are of course very closely tied. You are remembering the things you learn. And you'll see some of the stuff about observational and social learning come back when we circle around to social psychology later in the course. So, in general, though, when a psychologist is talking about learning, what is it that they are really getting at? A definition we might use: learning is a relatively permanent change in behavior or the potential to respond that results from experience. So, this is maybe a little more simplistic than you might tend to think about learning. You probably think about learning as I go to class to learn facts and history and the way things fit together. And that is what this means, but it also extends to things like understanding how to use a door, understanding what happens when the sun rises, understanding what it feels like when you have some particular sensation, right? All these very simple basic things are involved in learning as well. So, because there is so much information, we have to have some mechanisms for kind of filtering out all that different information in our environment. If we paid attention to everything, we would be constantly paralyzed by the flood of information. So we have to learn how to pay attention to relevant information and ignore irrelevant information. Some of that is built in basically with some of these automatic types of responses and tendencies that we have, and some of it, of course, is something that you have to engage in more consciously. We also, from classical conditioning, have a really good understanding of how we learn about associations between different events. So we'll cover that question there. Learning about the consequences of our own behavior and how different actions lead to different outcomes is maybe more in the area of operant conditioning, which we'll get to after classical. And then finally, as I mentioned, we'll talk about social learning. So it's not just that we're learning from our own direct experiences, we learn from our socialization and our observations of other people in our social environment. So, as I've said, there's just too much information for us to be able to pay attention to all of it. So, some of these mechanisms and processes are going to help us kind of weed out information that isn't necessary in our environment. So, how do we make sense of this? Maybe the most basic sort of response we have to information is to kind of filter it out based on whether it is novel or new or surprising to us. If something is novel, then we are going to tend to pay attention to it. So you can think about that as something you've never seen before, or as I'm sitting here looking out the window at my house, I have a very familiar view of the structures and trees and everything that's outside. And if anything would disrupt that usual picture that I have when I look out this window, then I would orient toward that. It would be a cue to me that it's something that I should pay attention to. So this is again, a very automatic inborn sort of tendency that we orient toward novel or surprising events. But if you're exposed to something over and over again, you're going to get used to it. And this process is called habituation. If you introduce something new outside my window, eventually I'm going to see it as part of the landscape, part of the backside of the house. and I'm not going to notice it as much. Similarly to how we talked about sensory adaptation in the sensation and perception unit, about how, maybe you put on a ring or a band-aid on your finger, and at first you notice the new sensations there that you hadn't noticed before, but then you get used to them. You ignore it because it becomes part of the tapestry of your experience after a little while. But this process can be kind of reversed. Our attention can be drawn back to things if there is a reason for it. If they start to indicate some new information to us, or these things we're used to start to do something we don't expect, then we might become resensitized to different stimuli and have a tendency to pay attention to them a little bit more. Even if we've seen that event many times, it could draw our attention back. A lot of the things that we will talk about in terms of learning are lessons that behaviorist psychologists in the early to mid 1900s really built the foundation for. And I've talked about behaviorism in the first unit of the class, and this should sound familiar, that these were people that basically said all this introspection junk that earlier psychologists are doing, all this stuff about the subjective experiences in people's heads, about what different processes are going on and what it's like to perceive a lemon or a sound or whatever it happens to be. That's all hooey, and we can only really study things in a more objective manner, where we're studying inputs or stimuli and outputs, or people's behavior or responses to those stimuli. So if we have to infer something about what's going on inside of people's heads, that's not science, according to a behaviorist at that time. They are people that need empirical, direct evidence. Now, more recently, after the cognitive revolution and how a lot of people think about psychology now, or most people, we know that the things going on inside of our heads are real. They may be less directly measurable, but they are happening, and they are affecting the way that we perceive and interact with the world. So this whole idea that behaviorism is pushing is outmoded at this point. Maybe the late 50s or early 1960s, people were starting to turn back towards thinking, it does matter how I understand things, and it does matter how I construe different events. And we'll return to this a bit when we talk about social psychology as well. A hallmark of behaviorism was something that's almost synonymous with it, really: stimulus response psychology. Really just trying to understand, again, what stimulus is going to lead to what response. How do we understand the input and output of what makes up human behavior, basically? Those were things that behaviorists said, we can observe these, we can measure these, in much the same way that a chemist can look at how different compounds are combined to create a particular reaction. They were trying to make it very hard sciencey, in a sense. So again, now this is not really how people think about this. It's part of our history, but it's context for why we understand things the way we do. It's not our current understanding. So this leads us to classical conditioning, which, oddly enough, is not something that was invented or discovered, however you want to put it, by a psychologist. This is something that was really spearheaded by a scientist that you have surely heard of, because his name has become part of common English parlance now. Pavlov. This was a physiologist, actually, who was trying to studied digestion. Actually, he'd won a Nobel Prize for digestion at the point where he was starting to look into conditioning. But because saliva is a part of the digestive process, he was basically trying to collect spit from dogs. So he was trying to do things like present them with food that would elicit saliva from them, cue them to release saliva from their glands in their mouths, so he could study it and do whatever he's going to do with dog spit. But that was how he kind of accidentally stumbled upon Pavlovian conditioning, or what we might call classical conditioning. So sometimes, people discover things they don't expect, like the polio, or not polio, like the, uh, why can't I think of the name of the antibiotic? Well, not going to think of it now, I guess. The thing that, penicillin. Sorry, 15 seconds of dead brain air. Anyway, so classical conditioning is basically how we learn about associations between things. Like, that when the sun comes up, it's going to be light outside. You know that when you pinch yourself, you're going to feel some kind of pain. You have these associations between different events, basically. And the way that you can test this and really model how this works is by giving people some kind of neutral stimulus and pairing it with one that already has some kind of response. So the terminology, I'm going to go through this. It is probably going to seem a little abstract as I go through it, but then I'm going to supplement that with some examples. So I think it helps to know the terms first. So the unconditioned stimulus in classical conditioning is something that has an automatic response. So in Pavlov's example, which I'll bring up again in just a minute, is he presented dogs with food, and that would elicit an automatic unconditioned response. So the food is the unconditioned stimulus. The saliva coming out of their salivary glands, is the unconditioned response. That's automatic. You don't need to condition people to have that, or dogs to have that association. It is a biological, built-in sort of reaction. The conditioning part that comes in is when you add a conditioned stimulus. When you add something else ahead of that food, and it is indicating that the food is coming to the dog or the person, whoever it is, then that response is going to become paired with that conditioned stimulus. And that response will become a conditioned response that's conditioned to occur in the presence of that conditioned stimulus. So again, that's very abstract. Let's go through some examples again. So to start out, I've already mentioned this one, but the unconditioned stimulus in the classic kind of Pavlovian model was the dog's food, and the unconditioned response was drooling, because it assists, again, with chewing and digestion. People always say that Pavlov was using a bell. This is apparently not quite accurate. He was more often using metronomes, the kind of timekeeping device you use with a piano or other instruments. So he was using a metronome before he would present a dog with food. So dogs started associating the metronome with the food, which elicits that now conditioned response to be associated with the metronome. So eventually, Pavlov could start the metronome, so the dog would hear the metronome and start to salivate before seeing the food, because that conditioned response of the drool or the saliva is paired now with the metronome. This, another example to bring it over to humans. This happens, this probably happened to some of you. It's happened to me, where you might get some kind of stomach virus, stomach flu. And when you have those types of infections, you have symptoms that come with them, like nausea, maybe even vomiting, if it's particularly unpleasant. And what can happen sometimes is that you might associate some food that you ate before having those negative digestive symptoms and the symptoms themselves. So maybe you ate oysters, for example, and then you started getting these stomach flu symptoms and you vomited. And you have this really strong association now. You've conditioned your vomiting response to be paired in your mind with eating oysters or whatever that food happens to be. So you go through your life, you get better, your stomach flu is gone, and it didn't actually have anything to do with the oysters. But now when you see oysters, you are, not ready to eat them. You feel sick just from the idea of that particular food, right? Pairing these things together, if it's a particularly memorable event like that, it can be something that sticks with you for a long time. So now that we have kind of a baseline level of what classical conditioning is like, we're going to get into some more specifics and technical things in the next video.